The terminal went dead quiet when the TSA officer grabbed the woman by the shoulder and shoved her bag across the counter, hard enough to scatter its contents across the floor. 300 people stopped moving. Phones came up. Nobody said a word. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just looked at the officer with eyes that had seen things this airport couldn't imagine. And that stillness, that absolute unnerving calm, was the thing that should have told everyone in that terminal exactly who they were dealing with. It didn't. That was their first mistake. If this story has you hooked from the first 10 seconds, you're exactly where I want you. Stay until the end. This one goes places you won't see coming. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Callaway International Airport sat in the northeast corner of Dryden Falls, Montana, one of those mid-sized regional airports that processed enough daily traffic to feel busy, but not enough to feel anonymous. 2 terminals, 11 gates, a Starbucks that closed at 8, and a burger counter that stayed open until the last flight out. On a normal Tuesday in late October, the main security checkpoint handled maybe 400 passengers between 6 and 10 in the morning. It was efficient, unglamorous, and staffed by people who had long since stopped looking at travelers as individuals. Lena Voss moved through the pre-check line the way she always moved, without urgency, without performance. She was 32 years old, narrow-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and scrubs that had been washed so many times the color had given up trying. She carried a single olive-green duffel that had more miles on it than most people's cars, and a smaller medical pack worn across her chest that she'd kept within arm's reach for the better part of a decade out of habit rather than necessity. She'd been in the field for 11 days. Not a hospital field, actual field. A mobile medical unit operating in a flooded rural corridor 2 states south, attached to a nonprofit disaster response organization that dispatched trained volunteers to areas where the regular system had already broken down. She hadn't slept a full night since Thursday. She had sutures on her left forearm from a piece of sheet metal that had caught her wrong when she was pulling a man out of standing water. She was tired in the specific way that went past her muscles into her bones, and all she wanted was to get through security, get to her gate, and drink something hot before the 2-hour flight back to her apartment in Ridgecrest. She placed the duffel on the conveyor belt, medical pack beside it. She removed her shoes, dropped her phone and keys into the bin, and stepped through the body scanner without prompting. The scanner beeped. The agent on the other side, a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a badge that read Crow B, held up one hand. Step to the side. Lena stepped to the side. Arms out. She raised her arms. The wand scan took 40 seconds. It flagged the suture kit clipped to her waistband, a small, sealed medical pouch she'd forgotten was there, and the metal ring at the base of her medical pack's frame. What's in the pouch? Suture kit. I'm a nurse. You can't carry that through without declaration. I declared it at check-in. It's on my boarding pass annotation. Crow looked at the pouch, the way people look at things they've already decided they don't like. He didn't check the boarding pass. He just turned and called across the checkpoint. Hey, Rafe! The man who appeared around the corner of the secondary screening partition was Sergeant Raphael Tanner, and the moment he materialized, the texture of everything changed. He was mid-40s, compact, with a jaw that looked like it had been clenched since birth, and the particular walk of someone who had decided a long time ago that authority was personality. He took one look at Lena, then at her bag on the belt, and something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion exactly, more like appetite. What do we have? Flagged suture kit. Says she declared it. Says. Tanner repeated the word like it was funny. He pulled on a pair of gloves. Let's take a look at the bag. I'm happy to show you the boarding pass annotation. I'm not asking about your boarding pass. He lifted the duffel off the belt without asking and set it on the secondary inspection table. I'm asking about the bag. Lena watched him unzip it. She didn't argue. She knew better than to argue at this point in the process, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that argument was what men like Tanner wanted. They needed friction to justify the next step. She gave him nothing to push against. He pulled out her clothes first, set them on the table in a pile, then her toiletry bag, which he opened and sorted through item by item, squeezing a half-empty tube of hand cream and examining her small bottle of saline spray with theatrical concentration. Then her emergency medical kit, a hard-sided case the size of a paperback novel, which he held up and turned over slowly. "What's this?" "Emergency medical kit. It's labeled." "It is labeled." He read the label. "Field Trauma Supply. Voss L." He looked up at her. "Where'd you get military-grade packaging on a civilian nurse's kit?" "It's not military grade. It's a commercial case with a label I printed myself." "Looks military." "A lot of things look like things they aren't." Something in his eyes went flat. He set the case down and pulled the medical pack off the belt next. "This too?" "That's my primary kit. I need it for work." "Work?" He said it the way Crow had said says, with just enough space around it to make clear he didn't believe her. He unzipped the main compartment, reached in. His hand closed on the thing at the bottom of the pack, the thing Lena had carried for 3 years without anyone ever noticing, and pulled it out. It was a small black cylinder, matte, finished, roughly the diameter of a marker, about 5 inches long, sealed at both ends. No visible markings. Tanner held it up. "What is this?" "Medical calibration tool." "Medical calibration tool." He turned it over. "Never seen one of these." "They're not common in civilian practice." "Where'd you get it?" "It was issued to me." "Issued to you by who?" Lena paused. Not because she was deciding how much to say. She already knew how much to say, which was almost nothing, but because she needed a second to assess exactly where this was going. Tanner's expression had changed again. There was something alert in it now, something that went past routine irritation into focus. He recognized the object, or he recognized what it implied. She wasn't sure which was worse. "By my previous employer," she said. "And who was that?" "That's a question I'm not in a position to answer at a public security checkpoint." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Tanner set the cylinder on the table, turned to the 2 officers flanking him, and said, "Get the supervisor." The supervisor was a man named Gerald Fetch, and he arrived with the energy of someone who had been interrupted during something he considered more important. He was 50s, soft in the middle, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a radio clipped to his belt that crackled every few minutes with traffic from the south checkpoint. He looked at the cylinder. He looked at Lena. He looked at Tanner. "She won't say who issued it." Fetch picked up the cylinder and turned it over. "This goes through the scanner?" "Clean. No material flag. The system tagged it as non-threatening." "Then why are we—" "Because she says it was issued to her by a previous employer she won't identify at a public checkpoint." Tanner's emphasis landed on "won't like a small piece of something heavy. And her kit is packaged in gear that doesn't match her credentials." Fetch looked at Lena. "Ma'am, can you tell us who you work for?" "Currently, I'm contracted with Meridian Response, a nonprofit disaster medical organization. My credentials and current employment are all in my check-in documentation." "And before that?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss prior employment in this context." "That's not really how this works," Fetch said. "Not unkindly, just factually. I understand that's how it seems, but that cylinder is associated with a restricted classification, and I'd ask that you contact the relevant federal office before making any decisions about it." Fetch blinked. "What federal office?" "The number is on the back of my ID." She reached toward her pocket. Tanner put his hand out, not touching her but blocking. She stopped. "I was reaching for my ID." "I'll get it." He patted her jacket pocket, found the ID wallet, and handed it to Fetch without giving it to her first. Fetch opened it, looked at the ID, then turned it over. On the back, handwritten in small, precise print, was a 10-digit number and a 2-letter code. DV. Fetch stared at it for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not recognition exactly, but proximity to it, like a word on the tip of his tongue. "What's DV?" "That's the question I'd recommend you ask when you make the call." He looked at the number again, then at her, then at the growing cluster of people near the checkpoint who were watching this whole exchange with the low-level entertainment of people waiting on delayed flights. "All right," he said. "Secondary screening room. Let's do this properly." The secondary screening room was a beige rectangle with a metal table, 2 plastic chairs, and a wall-mounted camera that Lena noted was positioned to cover the door, but left the far corner in shadow. She sat in one of the chairs and folded her hands on the table and waited while Tanner stood by the door and Fetch took the chair across from her. A third officer, whose badge she hadn't caught, stood against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her the way people watch things they find unsettling but can't explain. Fetch dialed the number. It rang 4 times. On the 5th ring, a recorded message answered in a voice that was completely neutral. "You have reached a federal verification line. Please state your badge number, location, and the nature of your inquiry." Fetch stated his badge number. He said Callaway International Airport, Dryden Falls, Montana. He said he had a passenger in secondary screening carrying an item that had been claimed as federally issued, classification unknown. There was a pause, then, "Please hold." The hold lasted 90 seconds. Tanner shifted his weight twice. The third officer uncrossed and recrossed his arms. Lena watched the camera in the corner and thought about nothing in particular. Then the line picked up, and the voice on the other end was not recorded. It was a man, and he sounded like someone who had been awake for a long time. "This is Agent Callum Dreyer, Defense Intelligence Coordination. Who am I speaking with?" "Supervisor Fetch, TSA, Callaway International." "Supervisor Fetch, I need you to do something for me right now." The voice was quiet but had a density to it, like weight without volume. "I need you to look at the person in the room with you and confirm her name." Fetch looked at Lena's ID in his hand. Voss Lena, Lena. The pause was very short. "Set the cylinder on the table, don't open it, don't scan it again, and do not allow anyone to remove it from the room. I'm going to need about 12 minutes. Fetch set the cylinder on the table. "Sir, can you tell me what I'm dealing with here?" "In 12 minutes, I can tell you more than you probably want to know. For right now, I need you to not make this situation worse than it already is." The line didn't go dead. It went to hold music. Faint, institutional. The kind of hold music that existed in federal phone systems and nowhere else on Earth. Fetch set the phone on the table and looked at Lena. She looked back at him. "You want to tell me anything?" he said. "I told you what I could." "That's not comforting." "I know." What happened in the next 11 minutes would later be described in the official incident report as a cascade. Not a single event. A cascade. The word that investigators used when one thing triggered another, and that second thing triggered a third, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, they were already in the middle of it. At minute 3, the terminal's federal screening alert system received an automated query from the DV classification line. The query cross-referenced Lena's name against a list of protected personnel identifiers. The match triggered a secondary alert, not a public alarm, not a red light, but an administrative flag visible only on Federal Link terminals within the airport's system. At minute 6, that flag was seen by a duty officer in the airport's Federal Coordination booth, a small room behind the main ticketing counter that most travelers didn't know existed. The duty officer's name was Petra Walsh, and she'd worked that booth for 9 years, and she had never in those 9 years seen the specific flag that appeared on her screen. She picked up her phone and made a call of her own. At minute 8, Tanner's radio crackled. He answered it, listened for a few seconds, and then looked at Lena in a way that was slightly different from how he'd been looking at her before. Not softer, just recalibrated. At minute 9, Gerald Fetch's phone came off hold, and at minute 11, before Fetch could get more than 6 words into his response to whatever Agent Dreyer was telling him, the explosion happened. It wasn't loud at first, which was the strange thing people remembered afterward. There was a low, heavy percussion, felt more in the chest than heard, followed by a half-second of absolute silence. Then the sound caught up with itself, and it was loud, and the terminal windows rattled in their frames, and the lights flickered, and every alarm in the building went off at once. Tanner was out the door before the echo died. Fetch was 2 steps behind him. The third officer looked at Lena, looked at the door, made a decision that was less a decision and more a reflex, and followed them out. Lena sat alone in the secondary screening room for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up the cylinder from the table, placed it back in her medical pack, slung the pack across her chest, and walked out. The terminal was chaos, not the screaming, stampeding kind, the disoriented kind, where people were frozen in place trying to locate the threat before committing to flight. Smoke was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the north end of the terminal, a dark column rising from somewhere on the tarmac below and to the left, and the smell of something chemical and hot was threading through the ventilation system. The intercom was cycling through an automated emergency message that wasn't designed for actual emergencies and therefore communicated nothing useful. Lena moved to the windows. The fuel service road that ran parallel to the northernmost runway had been the site of a collision. She could see that much from 40 feet up. A service vehicle of some kind had gone into a pump station, and the resulting fire had caught the adjacent tank vehicle, and now there was black smoke and orange fire, and at least 4 people visible on the tarmac in positions that said down and not moving. She was already unzipping her pack when she turned away from the window. The first person she reached was a man near Gate 7 who had gone down hard when the blast pressure came through the windows, not shattered, but flexed, and caught him wrong in the inner ear. He was on his knees, gray-faced, one hand on the floor for balance. She knelt beside him, checked his pupils, pressed 2 fingers against his neck. Pulse strong and fast. No blood. Vestibular disruption. "Hey." She kept her voice even. "Look at my nose. Right here." She pointed at her face until his eyes found hers and held. "Good. You're okay. It's your balance that's off, not your head. Can you sit against the wall?" He nodded. She helped him to the wall and kept moving. There were 2 more people down within the next 30 feet. A woman who had hit the edge of a seating row on her way to the floor and opened a 3-inch gash across her forearm, and a teenage boy who'd had a full anxiety response and was hyperventilating hard enough to have gone white around the mouth. Lena dealt with the arm first, pressure dressing from the kit, quick and efficient, no ceremony. Then moved to the boy, put both hands on his shoulders, and talked him down in the flat, direct way she'd learned worked better than gentle. Not unkind, just real. "You're not dying. I know it feels like you are. You're not. Breathe out first, out, slower." He breathed out. "Again." He breathed again. "Good. Stay here." She was moving toward the north windows again, trying to get a better count on the tarmac casualties, when she heard the sound behind her. Not from outside. From the checkpoint. She turned. Tanner was back. He'd been out less than 4 minutes, long enough to confirm the explosion on the tarmac, and apparently long enough to remember what he'd left unfinished. He was moving through the checkpoint with 2 airport police officers flanking him, and he was looking directly at her with an expression that had resolved itself into something specific and hard. "Hold it," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. "Step away from the passengers." Several of the travelers nearby went quiet. Lena stood straight. Her medical pack was open at her chest, gloves on, tourniquet still in her left hand from the arm laceration. "There are injured people. I said step away." He came to a stop 6 feet from her. The 2 police officers spread slightly to either side. "You left a secured screening room without authorization during a federal security event." "I left an unsecured room after being abandoned during an emergency." "That's not your call to make." "Someone made it for me when they left me alone in there." One of the police officers, younger, with the slightly sick look of someone who'd just been near the explosion site, was glancing between Tanner and the man near Gate 7 with the pressure dressing on his arm. He opened his mouth to say something and thought better of it. Tanner took a step closer. "Where's the cylinder?" "My pack." "Give it to me." "No." The word landed in the air between them like something dropped. The passengers nearby heard it. Tanner heard it. His jaw tightened. "You are interfering with a federal security operation. I'm providing emergency medical care to injured civilians in the minutes before actual emergency services arrive. If you want to stop me, you're going to need to physically stop me." She held his gaze. "And I'd think very carefully about how that looks on the body camera footage that has been running since you first approached me at the checkpoint." His eyes went to the camera on her pack. Small, mounted at the top corner of the main compartment. He hadn't noticed it before. She had been recording since the moment she placed her bag on the belt. The silence stretched 4 seconds. 5. Then the younger police officer stepped forward, not toward Lena, away from Tanner. "Sergeant," he said carefully, "there are casualties on the tarmac. Fire department's still 3 minutes out. Maybe we should—" "Shut up, Greer." "Sir, I'm just saying—" "I said shut up." Tanner hadn't taken his eyes off Lena. "You're going to come with me right now, or I'm going to put you in zip ties and walk you out of this terminal in front of every person here." Lena looked past him at the windows, at the smoke column, which had grown, at the shapes on the tarmac, which hadn't moved. Then she looked back at Tanner. "There's a man beyond that window with a crush injury to his lower leg," she said quietly. "He's been down for 6 minutes. In about 4 more minutes, without a tourniquet placed correctly, he's going to go into shock from blood loss. You can arrest me after." Tanner's radio crackled. He grabbed it. The voice on the other end was Fetch, and whatever he said made Tanner's face do something complicated. He answered in a clipped monosyllable and released the button and stood very still for a moment. Then he looked at Lena. Then he looked at the window. Then he stepped to the side. Not because he wanted to, because something in what Fetch had said had shifted his calculation in a direction he hadn't expected. And he was smart enough to understand that the next step he took was the one people would remember. Lena was already moving toward the emergency exit to the tarmac before he finished stepping aside. She went through the emergency door without triggering the alarm. The blast had knocked the sensor offline, and came out into the cold October air and the smell of burning fuel and the sound of people in various stages of panic and pain. The service road collision site was 60 yards away. She ran. There were 5 people down on the tarmac. A 6th was standing, but clearly not well. A ground crew member in high-visibility yellow who was holding her own arm at the wrong angle and walking in small circles the way people do when they're in shock and don't know it yet. Lena triaged in the first 40 seconds. The crush injury she'd described to Tanner was real. She'd spotted it through the window, a ground crewman whose leg had been caught under the bumper of the vehicle that had skidded on the blast pressure. She went to him first, applied the tourniquet in under 30 seconds, got confirmation of pulse above the placement, moved to the next. The others were burns and blast concussions, mostly manageable with the supplies she was carrying. She worked with the efficiency that came not from training alone, but from the particular kind of experience that couldn't be taught in a classroom. The kind that came from doing this in places where the next person to help was often 2 hours away. She was on her 4th patient when she heard them. The sound reached her before the vehicles came into view. Not sirens, something different, lower frequency. The mechanical drone of heavy vehicles moving fast on airport service roads, and underneath that, the specific tonal quality of military-grade rotors descending. She looked up. 2 black SUVs were coming in from the eastern perimeter access road, moving in a coordinated line at a speed that no civilian vehicle drove on airport property. Behind them, banking low over the tree line at the north end of the field, was a military helicopter, dark green, no visible markings, dropping altitude with intention. They weren't responding to the explosion. Their direction of travel was wrong for the explosion site. They were moving toward the terminal. One of the ground crew members, still standing, looked at the convoy and then at Lena. "Who are those people?" Lena finished taping the pressure dressing she was holding, sat back on her heels, and watched the SUVs cover the last 100 yards to the terminal access point. "That's a question," she said. "That's about to have a very interesting answer." The vehicles stopped. Doors opened. The people who emerged moved with the practiced economy of people who had never once in their careers been uncertain about where they were going. And every single one of them was moving toward the terminal where Tanner was still standing. The first SUV hadn't fully stopped before the passenger door came open. The man who stepped out moved like someone who had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to get somewhere wasn't speed. It was removing every obstacle between you and where you needed to be before anyone else in the room had decided there was a problem. He was tall, maybe 6'2", in civilian clothes that fit too well and sat too deliberately to be anything other than a deliberate disguise of rank. Dark jacket, dark pants, boots that had seen real ground. His hair was cut short enough to be professional and nothing else. He scanned the tarmac in one practiced motion. Fire site, casualties, responders, terminal windows, and his gaze landed on Lena with the quality of a man who had been handed a photograph and was confirming the match. He walked toward her directly. Behind him, 4 other people came out of the vehicles. 2 went immediately to the terminal entrance. 1 moved toward the fire site with a radio already at his mouth. The 4th stayed by the vehicles and opened a hard case in the back of the second SUV that Lena couldn't see into from where she was kneeling. The tall man reached her while she was still finishing a pressure wrap on the burned patient's forearm. He stopped 2 feet away and waited for her to finish. That patience, that specific patience, the kind that recognized the task in front of her mattered more than the task in front of him, told her more about who he was than anything he was about to say. She tied off the wrap and looked up. "Voss," he said. Not a question. "That's me. I'm Reeve. I work for the coordination office that owns the DV line." He crouched to her level without being asked, which reduced his silhouette and made the conversation less visible to the terminal windows above. "Are you injured?" "No." "The cylinder. Pack, outer left pocket." "Good. Leave it there." He glanced at her patience without appearing to look away from her. "How many total?" 5 down, 1 walking wounded with a probable fracture. All stable. Fire department still... She checked the time. 90 seconds out, maybe less. "Okay." He stood, looked up at the terminal. Something shifted in his expression, Paul. Not concern, but the anticipation of concern. "We have a problem that started before the explosion, and I need to understand how much of it you saw." "I saw enough." "Tell me about Tanner." She told him. Not everything, but the shape of it. The escalation at the checkpoint, the cylinder, Fetch's call, the way Tanner had come back after the blast with airport police, the decision to step aside. She kept it tight. Reeve listened without interrupting, which was a skill not everyone in federal work actually possessed. When she finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, the body camera footage. Running from checkpoint entry. Time-stamped. I use the same setup for field documentation. It's habit. Where does it sync? Secure cloud account. Automatic upload every 12 minutes. Reeve looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and something almost like relief. "You've been up how long?" 38 hours. "You treated 5 people in the last..." He checked his watch. 14 minutes. "Someone had to." He didn't respond to that. He turned toward the terminal and made a small gesture to one of his people near the entrance. Then he turned back to her. "When the fire department arrives, you're going to brief them on your patients and hand off. Then you're coming inside with me." "Am I under arrest?" "No." "Is Tanner..." Reeve's jaw moved once, like he was adjusting something in his mouth. "That's moving." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no in any direction that helped Tanner. Set. The fire department arrived in 2 units at minute 15 post-explosion, which was 3 minutes faster than the airport's average response time, and still felt slow to everyone on the tarmac. Lena briefed the lead paramedic in 90 seconds, patient by patient, intervention by intervention, medication administered, tourniquet placement time. The paramedic, a compact woman in her 30s named Delia, who had the look of someone who had been doing this job long enough to stop being surprised by anything, wrote it all down without comment and then looked at Lena's scrubs and the suture on her forearm. "You a medic?" "Nurse." "With this kit?" "Field experience." Delia looked at the tourniquet placement on the crush injury patient, which was textbook and then slightly better than textbook, and made a decision without saying it out loud. "We got it from here." Lena pulled her gloves, dropped them, and turned to find Reeve already 4 steps ahead of her, moving toward the terminal entrance. She followed. The terminal had changed in the 15 minutes she'd been outside. The initial panic had compressed into a wary, confused stillness, the kind of suspended state where people had stopped running but hadn't started processing. Maybe 200 travelers were still in the main concourse, clustered in groups, phones out, watching the 2 men from Reeve's team who had positioned themselves at either end of the security checkpoint without explaining to anyone why they were there or who they worked for. The men weren't in uniform. They didn't show badges. They simply stood at the edges of the space and made it clear, through some combination of posture and eye contact, that the checkpoint area was no longer available for public use. Tanner was near the checkpoint entrance. He was standing with Gerald Fetch and Officer Greer, the younger policeman, and the conversation between the three of them had clearly reached a point where no one was talking anymore. They were just occupying the same space with the particular tension of people waiting to find out what happens next. When Tanner saw Reeve come through the emergency exit door, followed by Lana, his expression went through 3 distinct stages in about 2 seconds. The first was recognition. The second was calculation. The third was the expression of a man who had made a calculation and didn't like the answer, but hadn't yet decided what to do with that. Reeve walked past Tanner without acknowledging him, stopped at the secondary screening room door, looked at Fetch. "I need this room. Everyone out except Voss." Fetch blinked. "Sir, with respect, I don't know your authority here." Reeve produced a credentials wallet from his inside jacket pocket and held it open for approximately 1.5 seconds. Whatever Fetch saw in it rearranged his priorities. He stepped back from the door. Tanner didn't step back. "I want to know what this is," he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was the thin, tight kind, the kind that came from effort. She walked out of a secured screening room during a federal security event. She's carrying an unidentified classified object, and she's refused every instruction to Sergeant Tanner. Reeve's tone hadn't changed at all. It was the same register he'd used to tell Fetch to clear the room, even, unhurried. "I know who you are." The silence that followed was maybe 5 seconds. "I beg your pardon," Tanner said. "That's not a threat, it's a statement." Reeve held the door to the screening room open for Lena without looking away from Tanner. "We'll get to you." Tanner's hand moved toward his radio. "I wouldn't," Reeve said quietly. The hand stopped. Lena went into the room. Reeve followed. The door closed behind them. The room felt smaller with 2 people in it and the stakes at their current altitude. Reeve sat across from her, same chair Fetch had used, which Lena noticed, and set a thin tablet on the table and typed something without showing her the screen. "I'm going to tell you some things," he said. "Some of them you already know, some you don't. I need you to hold all of it until I'm finished." "Okay." The cylinder is part of a field diagnostic set issued to members of a joint medical intelligence unit that was operationally active between 8 and 12 years ago. The unit was decommissioned. The equipment was supposed to be collected and cataloged. Some of it wasn't. He looked up. "You had it because you were issued it during active service and never asked to return it because, as far as the official record was concerned, you no longer existed in a context that required it." Lena said nothing. The DV classification code attached to your ID is a personnel protection marker. It flags your identity as connected to operations that are still sealed. Whenever someone runs a credential check on you through a federal system, which Fetch triggered when he called the verification line, it generates an automatic security notification to my office. He paused. "We've had that notification sitting dormant for 3 years, meaning no one has run your credentials through a federal terminal in 3 years. I don't travel much. You travel for Meridian. You've gone through 11 airports in the past 4 years. Regional airports, smaller systems. They don't always integrate with federal databases." Reeve looked at her for a moment. "Callaway does because it was upgraded 18 months ago. New federal contract, new hardware." He set the tablet down. "Which is relevant because the upgrade was part of a broader infrastructure change that we now know was partially influenced by a procurement process that wasn't clean." Lena felt the shape of something forming at the edges of what he was saying. She let it form without reaching for it. "What kind of not clean?" she said. "The kind where certain individuals with authority over airport security operations had financial relationships with the companies that won the infrastructure contracts, and where those same individuals used their access to the upgraded systems for purposes that had nothing to do with airport security." He turned the tablet around. On the screen was a photograph. Clear, surveillance quality, timestamp visible in the corner. It showed Raphael Tanner in a corridor she recognized as the employee access passage behind the main security checkpoint. He was handing a small object to a man in a ground crew jacket. The man's face was partially turned away from the camera, but enough was visible. Lena looked at the photo for a long moment. Then she looked at Reeve. "How long have you had this?" "This specific image, 6 days. The broader pattern, longer." He turned the tablet back. Tanner has been using his position to facilitate the movement of restricted electronics components through this airport's protected screening zone. The components are pulled from legitimate shipments, redirected, and moved through channels that don't get searched because the people doing the searching are on his side. What kind of electronics? The kind that come from military surplus disposal operations. Some of it is relatively minor, some of it is not. He said the last 4 words carefully. What Tanner was looking for in your bag wasn't contraband. He was looking to see if you were moving competing product. The thought settled over her like cold water. All of it. The way he'd gone straight to her kit. The way he'd recognized the packaging. The way his attention had sharpened when he found the cylinder. Not because he thought she was dangerous, but because someone in his network had flagged her arrival and he'd come to her line looking for something specific. He thought I was a runner, she said. He thought you might be a runner for a network that's been cutting into his operation. The cylinder fit the profile of a component his buyers have been looking for. Reeves' voice stayed level. He had no idea what it actually was. And when the federal verification flag hit his system, because the upgrade gave him visibility he didn't have before, he panicked and defaulted to escalation. He tried to have me detained. He tried to have you detained, searched beyond protocol, and discredited if you pushed back. Reeve folded his hands on the table, which you did not. I recorded it instead, which is significantly more useful. He looked at her in the same way he had on the tarmac. The assessment beneath the assessment, the question underneath the question. I need the footage. You'll have it. I need your statement about the checkpoint interaction, every detail, in sequence. I can do that. And I need you to understand something. He leaned forward slightly. What happens in the next few hours is going to be visible. We can't contain it. The explosion, the footage, the federal presence. There are too many civilian phones for this to stay quiet. By tonight, this airport is going to be a news story. And your name is in the middle of it. Lena looked at the wall behind his head. Outside, muffled through the terminal windows, she could hear the fire department working the tarmac site. She could hear the airport intercom cycling through its useless message. She could hear just barely the sound of people outside this small room continuing to exist in a world that had lurched sideways 40 minutes ago and hadn't fully righted itself. The classification, she said, will be reviewed. Given what Tanner triggered with the federal flag, we have grounds to declassify enough of your service record to protect you publicly. He watched her carefully. I can't promise the whole file, but enough. Enough to make clear I wasn't carrying stolen government property. Yes. And enough to make clear why he targeted me. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. There was a specific kind of tired that came not from lack of sleep, but from the effort of holding things in place for a very long time. And she felt it now. Not overwhelmingly, but clearly, the way you feel a weight you've been carrying when someone finally acknowledges it's there. Okay, she said. They were in the screening room for 22 minutes. When Lena came out, Reeves' other team members had made changes to the geography of the checkpoint area that were small and would be invisible to most observers, but that Lena understood immediately. One agent had taken a position at the door to the employee corridor behind the checkpoint. Another was standing near the main supervisory terminal. The third, the one who had been at the vehicles, was now seated at the checkpoint scanning console doing something that looked like a routine diagnostic and was very much not. Tanner was still there. He'd moved to the far end of the counter, near the staff entrance, and he was on his phone. When he saw Reeve emerge from the screening room, he ended the call. Too quickly, the way you end a call when you realize being on it at this particular moment is a thing that will be remembered. He straightened, put the phone in his pocket. Fetch was nearby, looking like a man who was revising his understanding of the last 2 hours in real time and finding the revision uncomfortable. Officer Greer was also nearby, and he had the expression of someone who had known something was wrong from the beginning and had not done enough about it, and was now calculating whether there was still time. Reeve walked to the checkpoint counter and addressed the room without preamble. I'm going to need all body camera footage from this checkpoint from 0600 this morning through current time. Supervisor Fetch, I need your access credentials for the security system archive. Officer Greer, I need your statement. Voluntary, not compelled, your choice. He looked at Tanner. "Sergeant Tanner, please don't leave the building." Tanner's jaw was tight enough to be visible. "Am I being detained?" "Not yet." "Then I'm under no obligation. You're under every obligation that comes with being a federal employee who has been identified in a preliminary review of a security irregularity." Reeves' tone hadn't changed. It didn't need to. "Not yet" means the next 20 minutes will determine the shape of that conversation. You can make that conversation better or worse. That's genuinely your choice. Tanner looked at Lena. She was standing slightly to Reeves' left, pack across her chest, hands at her sides. She wasn't watching Tanner with satisfaction or anger or any of the things a person might be expected to feel after the morning she'd had. She was just watching him with the clear, neutral attention of someone waiting to see what he would do with information he didn't want to have. He looked away first. Greer took a step forward. "I'll give a statement," he said, then quieter. "I should have said something earlier." "You can say it now," Reeves said. "That counts." The next hour moved in the way that complex situations move when someone competent is finally in charge. Not smoothly, not without friction, but with direction. Fetch provided archive access. Reeves' team pulled footage from 11 separate cameras covering the checkpoint area, the employee corridor, the tarmac access road, and 3 external approaches. Greer gave his statement in the secondary screening room, the same chair, the same table, but a different conversation. And when he came out, his face had the look of someone who had put something down that had been heavier than he'd admitted to himself. Lena sat near gate 6 and gave her own statement to a second agent, a woman named Marsh, who typed quickly and asked her questions in the precise, non-leading way of someone trained to collect testimony without contaminating it. She walked Marsh through every moment from the conveyor belt to the emergency exit, every word of every exchange, every observation she'd made about Tanner's behavior, and the moments that had felt wrong before she'd had language to explain why. "The moment he found the cylinder," Lena said. "The way he looked at it. It wasn't confusion, it was recognition. He'd seen something like it before, or he'd been told to look for it. You believe he received prior information about your arrival. I think someone flagged my booking in the airport system. If he had access to the infrastructure upgrades the way you're describing, access to the screening data, it wouldn't be hard to set an alert. Passenger name, origin city, flight manifest. He knew what gate I was coming through." Marsh typed without comment. "Is there anything else about his behavior that you want to include in the record?" Lena thought for a moment. "When I told him there was a man on the tarmac with a crush injury and that I needed to help him, Tanner stepped aside." She paused. "I don't think he did it because he decided I was right. I think he did it because Fetch said something on the radio that scared him. He knew by then that the federal flag had triggered something real, and he was already calculating exits. He let me go because stopping me in front of 200 witnesses and a body camera was a worse option than whatever he was planning next." Marsh looked up. "What do you think he was planning next?" "I think he was going to make a call, try to reach someone who could pull the flag before it went further." Lena looked toward the checkpoint. "I think that's the call I saw him ending when we came out of the screening room." Marsh followed her gaze, then made a note. "It was Fetch who found the first hard evidence. He didn't set out to find anything. He was pulling the archive footage under Reeves' instruction when the system threw an error on a specific file, a segment from camera 4, the corridor camera, from 3 weeks prior. The error was the kind that showed up when a file had been manually edited. Not deleted. Edited. Someone had trimmed 11 seconds from the middle of a continuous recording. The 11 seconds covered the timestamp that corresponded to a logged access event, a door opening in the employee corridor at 2:14 a.m. on a Sunday when the airport was between operational periods. Fetch stared at the error flag for a long moment. Then he walked to where Reeve was standing and said quietly, "You need to see something." Reeve looked at the screen. He pulled out his phone and made a call. The call lasted 40 seconds. When he put the phone away, he turned to the agent at the scanning console and said something low and direct that Lena couldn't hear from where she was sitting. What happened next was fast. The agent at the corridor door moved. 2 things happened simultaneously. Reeves' third team member stood up from the scanning console and turned to face the room, and from somewhere in the back of the building, the employee area, behind the checkpoint, there was the sharp sound of a door handle hitting a wall, the sound of someone moving quickly. Reeve was already at the corridor entrance. "Tanner?" His voice carried through the space without effort. The sound of fast footsteps stopped. There was a pause of maybe 3 seconds. Then Tanner appeared in the corridor doorway. He'd taken off his badge. It was in his hand, hanging loosely at his side, and that gesture, that specific gesture of removal, said more than anything he could have said with words. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Reeve said. "Please sit down." Tanner sat down. Not at the counter, on the floor against the wall. The way people sit when their legs have made a decision their mind hasn't caught up with yet. Greer, standing 20 feet away, watched this and exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath that sounded like something draining. Lena stayed at gate 6. She watched Tanner on the floor against the wall. She thought about the man on the tarmac with the tourniquet, who by now was probably in an ambulance. She thought about the boy she'd talked through his panic attack, and the woman with the arm laceration, and the gray-faced man near gate 7 who had let her point at her own nose until his eyes steadied. She thought about the last 3 years, the airport she'd moved through quietly, the way she'd learned to keep her credentials on the non-integrated regional carriers, the specific vigilance of living in a way that left no federal footprint. And she thought about the cylinder in her pack, which was just a calibration tool, but was also apparently something old enough and classified enough to crack a corrupt operation open at an airport in a Montana city where it should have done nothing and been noticed by no one. Reeve came to stand beside her. "Fetch found a tampered archive file," he said. "I heard the door. There's more in that corridor than we initially expected." He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his voice that was the dry cousin of satisfaction. The infrastructure upgrade gave his network significant capability. They've been using the corridor access as a transfer point for at least 18 months. Lena looked at the cylinder pocket on her pack. He was looking for something that fit a specific profile. And found something that blew the whole operation instead. Reeve glanced at her sideways. "You've been carrying that thing for 3 years. I forgot it was there most of the time." He was quiet for a moment. "Your footage is going to be the clearest record of the checkpoint interaction. Combined with the archive evidence and Greer's statement, it's enough," she said. "It's enough for Tanner. The rest of the network is going to take longer." He turned toward her. "I need you to understand that this doesn't resolve today. You're going to be asked to make yourself available for follow-on interviews. Your name is going to come up in the proceedings, and once we start declassifying the relevant portions of your record, it becomes difficult to unring that bell." "I know. You've been careful for a long time." "I have. This ends that." She looked out the terminal windows. The smoke column from the tarmac was still visible, but thinner now, the fire mostly suppressed. The afternoon light was coming in at an angle that made the floor-to-ceiling glass look almost gold. Outside, she could see the fire department wrapping their secondary line. An ambulance was still parked at the tarmac access road. A news van had appeared at the outer perimeter fence. "It was going to end eventually," she said. Reeve opened his mouth to say something else. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and whatever he saw made his posture change in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. A shift from manage to alert. He turned away from her, answered the call, listened for 11 seconds without speaking. Then, "When?" Another pause. "How many?" He didn't say anything after that. He lowered the phone and looked at the corridor where Tanner was now sitting against the wall with his badge in his hand. And something in Reeve's expression had changed into something Lena couldn't quite read. She'd seen a lot of faces in a lot of bad situations. The expression he was wearing now was the expression of someone who had found a thread and pulled it, and found that the thing on the other end was larger than the thread had suggested. "What is it?" she said. Reeve looked at her. He said 4 words. The file wasn't Tanner's. The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Lena turned them over once. The file wasn't Tanner's. 4 words, and the implication in them was a door opening onto something much larger than the room they were standing in. "Whose is it?" she said. Reeve's phone was still in his hand. He looked at it the way people look at things that have just changed the shape of their day in a direction they hadn't prepared for. Then he looked up at her, and she could see him deciding how much to say, and concluding that the time for measured disclosure had passed. Someone accessed the surveillance archive remotely, he said. Not Tanner. Someone above him in the system who had administrative credentials, the kind of access that comes with the infrastructure contract, not a TSA sergeant's badge. He turned toward the corridor. Tanner's been running the physical operation. Someone else has been managing the data layer, covering the access logs, editing the archive files. He paused. The call I just took was from our technical team. They traced the edit on the camera 4 file. The access signature belongs to a user account registered to the airport's federal infrastructure contractor. The company that won the upgrade contract. Yes. Lena thought about what he'd said in the screening room. Procurement process that wasn't clean, financial relationships between people with security authority and the companies that won the contracts. She'd filed it in the background then, behind the more immediate problem of Tanner. Now it moved to the front. The contractor has been managing the cover, she said, for at least 18 months, possibly longer, and the contractor has federal clearance because the infrastructure work required it. He pocketed the phone. Which means someone with federal clearance has been systematically removing evidence of an operation that's been running through this airport since before the upgrade. How high does it go? Reeves' expression gave her the answer before he said anything. The way his mouth set. The weight behind his eyes. We don't know yet. And until we know, I need to treat everyone in this building with federal credentials as a potential liability. He looked at her steadily. Including the people I brought with me. That wasn't paranoia. That was how this worked when the contamination was deep enough. She'd seen it before, in a context he didn't know about, and she wasn't going to explain in a terminal concourse at 2 p.m. What do you need? She said. Right now I need you to stay in this building. I need your footage secured, not on your cloud account, because I don't know who can access it. I need it transferred to a physically isolated drive. He reached into his jacket and produced a small device, matte black, no visible branding. And I need you to not talk to anyone, Shetz, press, police, airport staff, until I tell you it's safe. She took the device. It was a secure transfer drive, the kind issued to people doing sensitive field documentation in environments where standard digital channels weren't trustworthy. She recognized the format because she'd used one before, in a different life, under different circumstances. You came prepared, she said. I've been watching this airport for 6 days. I came prepared for Tanner. He paused. The rest of this is improvised. Transferring the footage took 9 minutes in the secondary screening room, which Reeve had cleared again. Lena connected the drive, initiated the transfer, and sat in the chair where she'd sat 3 hours ago across from a man who had been certain he was in control of the situation. The footage counter ran. Checkpoint entry to emergency exit, 112 minutes of continuous recording, every frame time-stamped and geographically tagged. While the transfer ran, she could hear Reeves' team working outside the door. Not loudly. The kind of work that happened in low voices and quick movement, the kind that didn't want an audience. She heard Fetch's voice once, higher than his normal register, and then Reeves saying something that brought it back down. She heard Greer ask a question and get an answer she couldn't make out. She heard nothing from Tanner. When the transfer completed, she ran the verification check, standard 4-digit confirmation, and handed the drive back to Reeve through the cracked door. He looked at the confirmation number, cross-referenced it against something on his phone, and nodded. Good. He stepped into the room and closed the door. There's something else. She waited. The account that edited the archive file. We ran a deeper trace in the last 8 minutes. He set his phone on the table so she could see the screen. It showed a text summary. Technical language, federal formatting, the kind of report that was written to be accurate rather than readable. The same credentials were used to access a separate federal database 11 days ago, a personnel database. Lena looked at the screen, at the date, at the name of the database. Her eyes moved to the specific record that had been accessed, and when she read it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 2 degrees without anything actually changing. The record accessed was hers. They pulled my file, she said. 11 days ago. The same week you deployed to the flood response corridor. His voice was careful. Someone with administrative access to federal contractor systems looked at your protected personnel record 11 days ago. She sat with that for a moment. 11 days ago, she had been in a drainage basin south of the state line, knees in standing water, working a collapsed structure with 3 other volunteers and a team of county firefighters. She had not been thinking about Dryden Falls or Callaway International or the cylinder in the bottom of her pack. She had been thinking about a 64-year-old man trapped under his own roof and whether the secondary beam above the egress point was going to hold another 20 minutes. "They knew I was coming," she said. "They knew you existed. We don't know if they knew you were coming here specifically, or whether your file came up as part of a broader search and Tanner's flag on your booking was coincidental confirmation. It doesn't matter which." She looked at the phone screen. Either way, someone with federal contractor access pulled a protected military record. That's not a TSA corruption case anymore. "No," Reeves said. "It's not." He took the phone back, looked at her. "I need to ask you something directly." "Okay." "Your service record, the portions that are still classified." He chose his words with the care of someone who had been briefed on a file but was aware of how much the briefing didn't contain. "I know the shape of it. I don't know the specifics. But whoever pulled your record 11 days ago, they know more than the shape. They know the specifics, which means they know what you're capable of, and they know you were coming through this airport today." He set both hands flat on the table. "Is there anything in your history that would make you a specific target? Not the cylinder, not the coincidence of Tanner's operation. You, specifically." The question was asked professionally, but it had weight. He wasn't asking out of procedure. He was asking because the answer would determine how afraid to be about the next several hours. Lena thought about a mountainside in a country she had never publicly been to. She thought about a procurement irregularity she had documented in a report that had gone up a chain she'd never fully seen the top of. She thought about the name of the defense contractor, not the one involved in this airport, a different one, that had appeared in the documents she'd helped recover before her unit was decommissioned. She thought about how much of that was still actionable. How much of it, if the right person found it, would constitute a reason to want her quiet, or discredited, or simply gone. "Possibly," she said. Reeve didn't push. He just nodded once, like the answer had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Okay," he said. "Then we move faster." Moving faster meant 2 things, and they happened simultaneously. The first was a call Reeve made to a number Lena didn't hear him dial, in a corner of the terminal away from the checkpoint, lasting 4 minutes. When he came back from that call, he had the look of a man who had asked for resources and been told yes, but with conditions he hadn't finished digesting. The second was what happened at the main terminal entrance. Lena was near Gate 6 when she saw it. A woman in a pressed charcoal blazer came through the main doors, moving at the controlled speed of someone who had purpose without wanting to show urgency. 40s, dark hair, a lanyard that was turned backward against her chest so the badge wasn't visible. She went directly to Fetch, who was at the supervisory terminal. She said something to him in a low voice. Fetch straightened like he'd touched something electric. He pointed toward the corridor, toward where Tanner was sitting. The woman in the blazer looked in that direction, and then she looked across the concourse at Reeve, and in the fraction of a second before she adjusted her expression, Lena saw something in her face that she recognized on a level below analysis. She'd seen it on the faces of people who walked into situations they'd been sent to control. The look of someone doing damage management. Reeve had seen it too. He was already moving toward the woman when Marsh, the agent who had taken Lena's statement, stepped into his path from the right and said something fast and low and close. Reeve stopped, listened for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Lena across 20 feet of terminal floor. She raised her chin half an inch. He understood. He turned back to Marsh and said something. Then he changed direction, not toward the woman in the blazer, but toward Tanner. He got there first. The woman in the blazer reached the corridor entrance 2 seconds later, looked at Reeve crouching in front of Tanner, and stopped. Her jaw was fractionally tight. "Agent Reeve." Her voice was the kind of smooth that required practice. "I wasn't aware you had field presence here." "I could say the same." He didn't look up from Tanner. "Who sent you, Director Sable?" Something moved in the woman's face. She recovered it immediately, but it had been there. The twitch of a person hearing their name in a context where they expected to be anonymous. Internal Affairs received a flag from the Federal Verification System. I'm here as oversight. Internal Affairs doesn't send deputy directors for a TSA irregularity. He finally stood, faced her. Not on a Tuesday afternoon in Montana. The scope of the irregularity, the scope isn't public yet, meaning you knew the scope before the public notification went out, which means you had access to the system alert before my team distributed it. He kept his voice even, conversational, the same register he used for everything. How? Director Sable looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at Lena. She looked at Lena with the specific attention of someone who was revising their plan in real time. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was 2 seconds of visible calculation, and Lena felt it land the way a physical thing lands. She knows who I am. Not from a briefing, not from a file pulled in a professional context. The recognition in Sable's eyes was the recognition of someone who had looked at that personnel record and understood what it meant. 11 days ago, the account with administrative contractor access. Lena didn't move. She held Sable's gaze with the same expression she'd held Tanner's with, not defiant, not afraid, just present, just watching. Sable looked away first. I think, she said to Reeve, that we should have this conversation somewhere private. I agree, Reeve said. Marsh, will you stay with Sergeant Tanner? It wasn't a question. Then to Sable, secondary screening room. They went in. The door closed. Lena stood in the concourse and felt the specific quality of a situation compressing. Tanner on the floor with his badge in his hand. Sable in the screening room with Reeve. Greer at the checkpoint looking at his own shoes. Fetch standing at his terminal doing nothing with the expression of a man who had understood too late that the ground he was standing on had been less solid than he thought. The news van at the perimeter fence had been joined by 2 others. Marsh came to stand near Lena, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough to communicate something without saying it. How bad is it? Lena said quietly. Marsh didn't look at her. She was watching the screening room door. When the flag hit our system 8 days ago, not the one today, an earlier flag from the database access, Reeve requested a full review of the infrastructure contractor's federal credentials. The request was processed and returned with a clean clearance. Who processed it? That's what we're currently asking. Lena looked at the screening room door, at the small rectangle of wire-reinforced glass set at eye level, through which she could see nothing. She came here to contain it, she said. That's our working assumption. She came here to contain Tanner before he could give up anything about the data layer, about whoever was managing the cover. Lena paused, which means Tanner knows something that connects to her. Marsh was quiet. He knows her, Lena said. It wasn't a question. The shape of it was too clean. He received a text message 4 minutes before we entered the building, Marsh said. We have the number. We're pulling the trace now. The screening room door opened. Reeve came out alone. He walked directly to Lena and stopped in front of her and said, in a voice stripped of everything except the essential information, she's asking for a joint debriefing. Her and me and someone from the Inspector General's office. She wants the investigation coordinated through her unit. She wants to run it, Lena said. She says she wants to cooperate. What does she actually want? Reeve looked at her for a long moment. She wants the footage. The footage. Not Tanner's statement, not the archive evidence, not Greer's testimony. The footage, Lena's body camera footage, the 112 minutes of continuous recording that showed everything at the checkpoint, including the moments before Tanner had known he was being watched. The footage that was now on a physically isolated drive that Reeve's hands. Lena thought about the shape of the last 4 hours, the way the morning had started, her bag on the belt, her shoes in the bin, the simple mechanics of trying to get from here to home. The way one man's misidentification of a calibration tool had cracked a network wide enough to pull a deputy director to a regional airport in Montana on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about the record accessed 11 days ago. Her record. Not Tanner's, not the airport's. Hers. Don't give it to her, Lena said. Reeve nodded once, very slightly, like she'd said something he needed to hear confirmed. I'm going to need you to do something, he said, and I'm going to need you to do it in the next 10 minutes before she finds a way to make a call I can't intercept. What? He reached into his jacket, produced a second drive, this one different from the one she'd transferred to. Older format, the kind of drive that didn't connect to any modern network because it predated the networks. In 2017, he said, a joint medical intelligence unit operating under DV classification submitted a report through a restricted channel. The report documented procurement irregularities connected to a defense contractor that was also doing federal infrastructure work. He held the drive out. The report was never processed. It was flagged as unverified and archived. But the case number is still live, and the original submitting officer's name is attached to it. He held her gaze. That name is yours. She looked at the drive. If the report gets formally resubmitted through the Inspector General's line, not Sable's unit, the IG's independent channel, it becomes a live federal complaint, he said. It triggers mandatory review. It takes the entire investigation out of Sable's jurisdiction and puts it somewhere she can't touch. The IG's channel requires physical submission, she said. A form, a secure terminal, a verified identity in person. There's a federal annex 4 miles from this airport. We have a vehicle. Lena looked at the drive in his hand, at the door of the screening room where Sable was waiting, at Tanner, on the floor in the corridor, at the news vans beyond the perimeter fence, which were now 3 and would shortly be more. She thought about the man in the flood basin 2 weeks ago, the collapsed beam, the 20 minutes that had mattered. She took the drive. How long do I have before she realizes what we're doing, she said. Maybe 8 minutes. Possibly less if she has a contact inside this building I haven't identified. Does she? He looked at the checkpoint, at the main supervisory terminal, at the agent from his own team who was standing at the scanning console. The agent, who had been still and facing away from them, turned his head slightly to the left, not looking at them, but oriented toward them. The small wrongness of it was a thing that took exactly 1 second to register. Reeves' hand closed around her arm above the elbow. Not hard, but firm and definite. Side exit, he said. Right now. They were moving before the sentence finished, and behind them, Lena heard the scanning console agent push back from his seat and stand, and from the screening room came the sound of a door handle turning, and from the corridor entrance came the sharp sound of Tanner's voice saying something she couldn't hear, and all of it converging in the space of a building that had become, in the last 4 hours, a very different kind of trap than the one she'd walked into this morning. The side exit was a fire door at the end of the North Concourse, past Gate 11, past the closed Starbucks, past a janitorial cart that had been abandoned mid-hallway when the evacuation alarm ran. Reeve moved fast without running, the particular speed of someone who understood that running drew more attention than it avoided. Lena matched him step for step. Behind them, she heard the scanning console agent say something. Not loudly. The kind of thing said to create a record of having said it. Stop. Federal security. The words had the texture of performance rather than genuine command, someone establishing that they'd made the attempt, not someone who expected compliance. Reeve hit the crash bar on the fire door. Cold air came through hard. They were on a service walkway along the building's exterior, concrete and steel railing, the tarmac spread below and to the left, the parking structure to the right. The door closed behind them. Reeve had his phone out before the door latched. He was dialing without looking at it, eyes moving across the service road below. Kepler, side exit, North Concourse, 60 seconds. He ended the call. Lena had the drive in her jacket pocket. Her pack was across her chest. She could feel her heartbeat, which was elevated but not uncontrolled, the body doing what it was built to do, processing threat and calibrating response. She'd felt this before in different contexts, in places where the threat had been physical rather than institutional, and the strange truth was that this felt the same compressed clarity, the same sense of the world narrowing to the next 30 seconds. The agent at the console, she said. Yours. Was mine. His jaw was tight. I need to assume Sable made contact with him before she walked through those doors, before she even landed in Dryden Falls. He looked at his phone, which tells me the original security flag, the one from the federal verification line, was visible to her network before it reached my office. There's a routing compromise somewhere in the notification chain. She saw the flag before you did. She had hours to prepare. I had a phone call. He looked down at the service road. A black SUV was coming around the corner of the terminal building, moving at the deliberate, unhurried speed of airport service vehicles, which was the right speed for not triggering security cameras. That's Kepler. They went down the external stairs at the far end of the walkway, metal, slightly slick from the morning cold, Lena's hand on the rail for exactly 2 steps before her body adjusted. The SUV pulled up as they hit the bottom. The driver was young, early 30s, with the compact efficiency of someone who had learned to exist in small spaces and move through large ones quickly. He didn't say anything when they got in. Federal Annex on Harker Road, Reeves said. Don't use the main approach. The SUV moved. The Federal Annex was a building that looked like nothing. That was deliberate. 4 miles from the airport on a light industrial service road, it occupied a footprint between a freight logistics company and a regional utilities substation, and it looked like both and neither. Beige exterior, minimal signage, parking lot that was 2/3 empty at any given time. The kind of building that your eye passed over and moved on. Inside, it was a different thing entirely. Kepler had clearance to the front entrance, which got them past the first desk. After that, Reeve took over. Credentials, identification, verbal authorization codes that Lena recognized as the specific format of DV class clearance, which was a format she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. The staff at the second desk moved efficiently without the performance of urgency, which was the sign of a well-run facility, and within 4 minutes of their arrival, they were in a secure workroom on the second floor with a federal IG submission terminal and a man named Hargrove, who introduced himself as a deputy with the Inspector General's office and looked at Lena's name on Reeves' documentation with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular file to move for longer than they'd expected. The original case number is still live, Hargrove confirmed. He was 50s, reading, glasses pushed up on his head, the kind of deliberately neutral affect that came from years of processing situations where showing reaction was professionally costly. He was looking at his terminal, not at Lena. Last activity on record was 2017. Flagged unverified, archived, no further action. He paused. The individual who flagged it unverified was... He stopped. Read something on his screen. Read it again. Supervisor-level access in the Federal Contractor Coordination Office. Reeve didn't move. Name. Hargrove turned his monitor slightly. On the screen, next to the case action log entry dated November 14, 2017, was a username, a federal employee identifier. The name attached to it was Marilyn Sable. The room was quiet for a moment. She buried it, Lena said. Not with anger, just with the flat recognition of something that had been true for a long time and was only now visible. She was in contractor coordination in 2017, Reeves said. Not quite to anyone. Working it through. Before the internal affairs appointment, before the deputy director role. He looked at Hargrove. She had access to incoming reports from restricted channels and the authority to archive them without review. And she archived this one. Hargrove looked at Lena for the first time. Which is your report? It's my report, she said. The resubmission, Hargrove said, requires your physical presence, your verified identity, and the original documentation. He nodded at the drive in her hand. If that contains what I think it contains, we can open a formal IG complaint within the hour. Once it's open, jurisdiction transfers to this office, automatically and irrevocably. He said the last word with the care of a man who understood what it meant to the woman sitting across from him. Lena set the drive on the desk. Let's open it, she said. Todd. The documentation process took 41 minutes, which was faster than it should have been, and only possible because Hargrove was the kind of official who had the authority to compress timelines and the judgment to know when to use it. The drive contained the original field report, technical language, operational details, contractor names and contract numbers. A procurement irregularity that in 2017 had looked like a mid-level corruption case, and in the context of everything that had happened since, looked like the foundation of something much larger. It also contained something Lena hadn't known was there. She'd handed Reeve the drive in the terminal. She hadn't loaded it herself. When Hargrove opened the second file partition, password protected, which Reeve provided, it contained supplementary documentation that Lena had never seen. Additional records, internal communications, transaction logs, the kind of material that didn't come from a field report, that came from someone with access to systems she'd never had clearance for. She looked at Reeve across the table. The second partition, she said, was added by my office. He met her gaze without apology. 3 days ago, when we started pulling the thread on the contractor credentials, we found documentation that cross-referenced back to your original case number. We attached it because if we were going to resubmit, we were going to submit everything. You've been building this for 3 days. We've been trying to build it. Without knowing who in the system was compromised, we needed a submission that came from a verified independent source. He paused. We needed your name on it, not ours. Lena looked at the screen, at the transaction logs, which showed a pattern of payments from a federal contractor account to a series of LLCs that were, with about 2 hours of documented tracing, traceable back to a holding entity registered to a deputy director of internal affairs. You used me, she said. The words weren't accusatory. They were accurate, and she said them accurately, and she watched him decide how to answer. I flagged your travel because the DV notification gave me a legal basis to establish contact, he said. Everything that happened at that checkpoint, Tanner, Sable, the footage, the archive files, that was real. I didn't manufacture it. He held her gaze. I needed a submission vector that Sable couldn't preemptively close. Your original case number is the only live DV class complaint on record that predates her access to the routing system. So she can't flag it unverified again. She has no jurisdiction over complaints filed under a live case number through the IG's independent channel. The moment Hargrove processes this, it's outside her reach. He folded his hands. I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier. I made a judgment call about what you needed to know and when, and you can decide for yourself whether it was the right one. The honest thing about it, the thing that made it harder rather than easier, was that she'd made the same kind of call before, in a different context with different stakes for what she'd believed were the right reasons. She knew what it felt like from inside. She knew it wasn't always wrong. Process it, she said to Hargrove. Hargrove processed it. At 3:47 p.m., a formal Inspector General complaint opened under case number DV-0441-17-R, with Lena Voss as the originating officer and an attached evidence package that included field documentation, surveillance footage, transaction records, and a secondary complaint naming Marilyn Sable as the individual responsible for the original improper archival. Hargrove printed the confirmation, handed it to Lena. This goes to the IG's senior review panel within 24 hours. They'll issue an investigative hold on all related federal accounts and credentials pending review. He looked at her over his reading glasses. That includes hers. They were back in the SUV 12 minutes later. Reeves' phone had 4 missed calls, all from numbers he identified by area code and didn't call back. Kepler was driving the same way he'd driven before. Deliberate, unremarkable, the speed of someone who understood that the most valuable form of movement was the kind nobody noticed. What happens at the airport now? Lena said. Sable's credentials will flag within the hour when the hold processes. She'll know the complaint has been filed because her own system will tell her. He was looking at his phone without dialing anything. She'll make a calculation. She's made a career of making calculations. She'll run. She'll try. He said it without particular satisfaction. Her vehicle is in the airport parking structure. Her phone is on a federal carrier account that's now part of the complaint package. Her travel credentials. He paused, looked at something on his phone. A message had come in while they were in the annex. He read it twice. Her travel credentials were flagged 4 minutes ago by the IG's emergency hold protocol. He set the phone down. She's not going anywhere. Lena looked out the window at the service road unreeling in front of them. The flat Montana afternoon, the sky gone the particular gray of late October clouds moving in, the freight company and the utility station and the airport perimeter fence visible in the distance. She thought about Sable in the secondary screening room, waiting, calculating, making the moves of someone who had been making moves in systems like this for long enough to believe the systems bent around her. She thought about what it felt like to be in a system that had bent and was now, finally, unbending. The SUV turned onto the main airport approach road. "We're going back," she said. "There are people at that airport who don't yet know what just happened. Tanner doesn't know the IG complaint is open. Sable doesn't know yet." He looked at her. "And there are things that happen when people find out in person rather than through a notification on a screen. Evidence that hasn't been properly secured. Statements that haven't been completed." He paused. "And Greer, who stuck his neck out and deserves to know, the ground didn't swallow him for it." Pat. The parking structure entrance was blocked by 2 police vehicles when they arrived. Not Reeves' team, Dryden Falls PD, responding to the airport emergency that had been generating calls for the last 2 hours. Kepler showed identification at the barrier, and they were waved through without delay. The federal hold had already hit local law enforcement channels, which meant the situation at the terminal had been elevated to a level that brought out the people with the most stripes on their shoulders. Inside the terminal, the geography had shifted again. The 2 police vehicles had become 6. The news vans beyond the perimeter fence had become 5, and there were reporters visible at the outer barriers with cameras pointed at the terminal entrance. The main concourse had been cleared of most travelers, who had been rerouted to a holding area in the south terminal where airport staff were processing rebooking with the mechanical determination of people who had been given a task to focus on so they didn't have to think about the larger situation. Tanner was no longer on the floor in the corridor. He was at a table near the checkpoint, seated across from a Dryden Falls PD detective who had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and his notepad out. Tanner was talking. He was talking with the specific velocity of someone who has spent several hours calculating and has concluded that the side of the table he's been sitting on is the wrong side, and that the window for changing sides is closing. Lena saw this from across the concourse and understood it immediately. He was giving up the network. Not everything. Nobody gave up everything in the first conversation, but enough. Names, probably. Dates. The shape of the contractor relationship. The kind of information that cost him something but bought him the thing he now needed more than anything, which was distance from Sable. Reeves saw it too. He adjusted course and went to the detective without hesitation. Credentials, a brief exchange, the detective nodding and turning his notepad so Reeve could see what was written. Reeve read for a moment, wrote something on a separate card and handed it to the detective. Then he came back to where Lena was standing. He gave up 3 names. One of them is the contractor's federal compliance officer, the person responsible for managing the access credentials that were used to edit the archive file. Not Sable directly. Not yet, but it's the next layer down, and the next layer down will give up the one above it. He looked toward the secondary screening room. Sable is still in there. Waiting. Waiting. She doesn't know the IG complaint is filed. She doesn't know her credentials are flagged. She thinks I'm still in the building making decisions about what to do with the situation she walked into. He looked at Lena. She'll find out in about 10 minutes when the hold notification reaches her phone. You want to be there when she finds out. I want you to be there when she finds out. He said it carefully, not like a tactic, more like he was giving her something that was hers. The report that she archived in 2017 had consequences for your unit, for your service record, for 3 years of your life. He paused. It seems like something you should see. Lena looked at the screening room door, the small rectangle of wire-reinforced glass, the beige rectangle behind it that she had now sat in twice in the same afternoon for very different reasons. She thought about the things that had happened in the years since 2017 that she had attributed to circumstance, to the natural decompression of a career that had operated at an unsustainable intensity, to her own choices. The quiet life in Ridgecrest, the Meridian contracts, the regional airports. She thought about whether those years would have been different if the report had been processed, if the case had gone forward, if the file hadn't been sitting in an archive under a flag that said unverified and an identifier that belonged to Marilyn Sable. She probably would have ended up somewhere like here regardless. That was the honest answer. The quieter life had suited her in ways she hadn't expected. She wasn't going to perform outrage she didn't entirely feel. But she had submitted that report. She had documented what she found and put her name on it and sent it up the chain. That had meant something to her then. It had been a thing she did because she believed it mattered whether the truth was recorded, regardless of what happened to it next. Someone had decided her work didn't matter. She wanted to see that person's face when they found out it had mattered anyway. "Okay," she said. They went into the screening room together. Sable was seated at the table with the composed posture of someone who had prepared themselves for a range of outcomes and was currently settled on the one that required patience. She had her hands folded on the table and her expression arranged in the professional neutrality of a deputy director who had navigated difficult situations before and expected to navigate this one. She looked at Lena when they came in. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A slight adjustment, an internal recalibration. "Agent Reeve," she said, "I was beginning to think you'd decided to resolve this without me." "We've made some progress," Reeve said. He sat down. Lena stood. "I'd like to get ahead of the press situation," Sable said. "5 news vans outside and the body camera footage from—" Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Reflexively, quickly, the way a person glances at their phone when they're in a meeting they control and want to stay in control of. The glance was supposed to last a fraction of a second. It lasted 3 full seconds. Her eyes moved through something on the screen with the speed of someone who was reading faster than their face was prepared for. When she looked up, the composure was still there, but the quality behind it had changed from settled to frozen. "The Inspector General's complaint line," Reeve said, "doesn't require my authorization. It only requires a verified identity and an active case number." He looked at her steadily. "DV-044-1-17 has been active since 2017. It was never formally closed." Sable set her phone down on the table, very slowly. "You don't have the authority. The originating officer filed the resubmission in person at the federal annex on Harker Road 40 minutes ago." He paused. "Her name was already on the case." Sable looked at Lena. Lena looked back at her. There were things a person could say in this moment. Lena didn't say any of them. She stood and watched Sable's face process the architecture of what had happened. The drive, the annex, the 41 minutes, the confirmation that was now sitting in the IG's senior review queue under a case number that Sable had buried 8 years ago under the belief that it would stay buried. The composure didn't break. People like Sable didn't break in the way that was satisfying in films, the sudden collapse into confession and tears. What happened instead was more specific and in its own way more complete. A narrowing. The careful professional neutrality became something smaller and more deliberate, the expression of a person managing a retreat. She looked at her phone once more, looked at the door, looked at Reeve. "I want counsel," she said. "That's your right," Reeve said. Exactly what he'd said to Tanner on the floor. "Please don't leave the building." He stood, left the door open behind him. Lena followed him out. Greer was at the far end of the concourse near Gate 9, sitting in one of the plastic chairs with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands. He'd been there for a while from the look of it. When Reeve and Lena came toward him, he stood, too quickly, with the instinct of someone who expected the approach to be procedural. "Sit down," Reeve said, not unkindly. Greer sat. "Your statement was complete and accurate," Reeve said. "It was useful. The fact that you gave it matters." He looked at the younger officer with the directness of someone who didn't do reassurance as a professional habit, but was doing it now because it was warranted. "You're going to be called as a witness in the federal proceedings. That's a consequence of doing the right thing late, and there's no way to avoid it. But it's not the same thing as being in trouble." Greer looked at his hat. "I should have said something this morning. When Tanner started..." He stopped, tried again. "I knew it was wrong." "You said something when it counted," Lena said. He looked at her. Something in his expression asked whether that was true or whether she was saying it to make him feel better. She held his gaze. "The man near Gate 7, she said. "The one who hit the floor when the blast came through. You were looking at him when Tanner was telling you to focus elsewhere. You were checking whether he was okay." She paused. "That was a choice too." Greer looked back at his hat. Reeve left them there for a moment and went to his remaining agent, not the console agent, who had removed himself from the situation quietly enough that no one had formally stopped him, which was a problem for a different conversation. and they conferred for several minutes over the supervisory terminal. The terminal was quieter now, the peculiar post-crisis quiet of a space that had been running too hot and was cooling. A few travelers who hadn't been rerouted were sitting at gates, watching their phones, watching the news vans outside the window, recalibrating their afternoon. The checkpoint was closed and marked with standing barriers. The corridor to the employee area had police tape across the entrance that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. Fetch was at his terminal doing something that had the quality of a man putting things in order before a reckoning he understood was coming. He wasn't running. He wasn't calling anyone. He was just organizing, the way people organize when they need to feel like they have some control over the shape of things. He noticed Lena standing nearby and looked at her with the expression of a man who had things to say and wasn't sure any of them would help. "I didn't know what he was doing," he said. "Tanner. I knew he was... I had a sense, maybe, that he operated differently than he should, but I didn't know the specifics." "I know," Lena said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He absorbed that, looked at his terminal. "I found the archive file." "You did? If I hadn't called you back to secondary screening, if I'd just let you through, then he would have confiscated the cylinder, realized what it was, and destroyed it," she said. "And the DV flag would have been suppressed before Reeves' office saw it." She thought about it for a second. "You doing your job badly turned out to matter. That's not a pattern you should rely on, but this time it did." Fetch made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's a terrible thing to tell a person." "It's true, though." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was complicated and tired and not entirely without a sense of the absurd. "Are you going to be okay?" he said. "After all this." It was the kind of question people asked when they meant something more specific but didn't have the language for it. She understood what he was actually asking, whether the morning she'd had, the exposure, the end of 3 years of careful invisibility, was going to be survivable. She thought about the IG complaint, which was now open and irrevocable and had her name on it. She thought about the footage, which was on a secured drive in federal custody and would be in a court record inside of 90 days. She thought about Sable in the screening room with her phone and her counsel request, and Tanner talking to the detective with the rolled-up sleeves. She thought about the cylinder in her pack, which had started all of this, a calibration tool she'd carried for 3 years out of habit, a piece of equipment from a life she'd stepped away from, attached to a case number that someone had buried because they needed it buried. She thought about the man in the flood basin, the collapsed beam that it held. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." Fetch nodded, looked at his terminal, went back to his organizing. Reeve found her near the north windows 20 minutes later. The smoke column from the tarmac was gone. The fire department had cleared the site. The ambulances were gone. The tarmac itself was empty except for the investigative vehicles near the collision point and the yellow perimeter tape marking the area that ground operations wouldn't have access to for at least another 48 hours. Sable's counsel arrived, Reeves said. He stood beside her looking at the same window. "Local attorney. She made one call before the hold flagged her phone, and that's who showed up." He paused. "Not a federal defender. Not anyone connected to the contractor network. A local attorney." He said it with the tone of a man adding something up. "She's not calling in favors. She's not triggering contingencies. She's isolating." "She's deciding who she's giving up," Lena said. "That's my read." The compliance officer Tanner named, the one who managed the contractor credentials. "We have a name and a federal employee number. Warrants are being prepared." He turned slightly. "It's going to go up from there. The transaction records in the IG package are specific enough that there are at least 3 more individuals with documented financial connections to the contractor account. One of them," he paused with the weight of the specific pause, "sits on the Federal Infrastructure Oversight Committee." Lena looked at the window. "How long does that take?" she said. "Months, possibly longer." He was honest about it. "The IG process is thorough. It's not fast. But it's irrevocable." "Irrevocable," he said. "Yes." She nodded once. He reached into his jacket and produced a document, 2 pages, folded. He held it out to her. "This is the formal declassification notification for the relevant portions of your service record. It went through 30 minutes ago, expedited under the IG Complaint Authority." He waited for her to take it. Enough of your history is now public record to make clear who you are and why you were carrying what you were carrying. She took it, unfolded it, read the first paragraph, which was dense with bureaucratic language that she translated in her head into its actual meaning. The woman who was publicly accused of carrying stolen government property this morning was, in fact, carrying property issued to her during classified service operations. She was targeted. She was right. She folded it back, put it in her jacket pocket. "There's something I need to tell you," Reeves said. His voice had changed slightly, not colder, but more careful. She waited. "The compliance officer that Tanner named. We ran the federal employee number while you were with Greer." He looked at her steadily. "The account exists. The transaction records are real, but the physical person attached to that employee number..." He stopped. "The account was created using a stolen identity, somebody else's name, someone who retired from federal service in 2019 and has no knowledge of this." Lena felt something adjust in the back of her thinking. "The account is a ghost," she said. "The account is a ghost, which means whoever was managing the data layer wasn't using their own credentials. They were using a constructed identity layered on top of a real federal employee number that was dormant enough not to generate anomalies." He looked at her. "It's sophisticated. It's the kind of construction that requires specific technical capability and specific access to federal HR systems." "Or someone who used to have that access," Lena said. "Or someone who still does." He let that settle. "We're pulling the construction history of the account now, but whoever built it knew federal systems well enough to build something that held for at least 18 months without triggering a flag." He paused. "Sable had the motive and the position. She didn't have the technical background." He looked at her carefully. "But she worked with someone who did, someone from the original procurement irregularity case. Someone who would have known your report was coming." Lena looked at the window, at the empty tarmac, at the late afternoon light coming in flat and gray. In her jacket pocket, the declassification document sat against the transaction log drive, against the suture kit she'd forgotten to take out. 3 things from 3 different parts of the same day, and underneath them the particular cold feeling of something she had missed. She went back through the morning, the checkpoint, the cylinder, the way Tanner had looked at it. He'd recognized it. Not the cylinder specifically, the format, the packaging, the profile of what someone would be carrying if they were moving a specific kind of component through a secure corridor. He'd been told to look for someone matching that profile, not her specifically. Someone matching that profile, which meant someone had flagged the profile in the system before she arrived, before her flight had even landed. Someone who knew what the cylinder looked like and what it would register as on an airport scanner and who would be carrying it. Someone who had seen her original report, who knew what the cylinder was because it was in the documentation, who had 11 days ago accessed her personnel record to confirm she still had it. Someone who had, in 2017, been close enough to the procurement irregularity to understand the specifics of what she'd found. Not Sable. Sable had been the administrator, the one who filed the flag and archived the case and kept the cover clean. But the case had reached her office through a restricted channel. And before it reached her office, it had been processed by someone in the intake chain, someone who had read it and understood it and made a decision about what to do with it. Someone who was still, apparently, active. She turned to Reeve. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had arrived at the same place from a different direction and was waiting to see if they'd reached it at the same time. "The ghost account," she said. "The construction date." He nodded slowly. "When was it built?" "November 2017. He said it quietly. 4 days after your report was submitted. The afternoon light came through the terminal windows and lay flat across the floor between them. "Someone inside the DV classification channel," she said. "Someone who had access to the report before it reached Sable's desk." Reeves' phone was in his hand. He wasn't dialing it. He was looking at it the way he'd looked at his phone in the screening room hours ago. Not at the screen, through it. "We have everything we need to process Sable and Tanner and the network they ran," he said. "What we don't have is the original source, the person who read your report in 2017 and decided it needed to disappear and built the infrastructure to make that happen and has been maintaining that infrastructure for 8 years. He met her eyes. I've been working this case for 6 days. I thought Sable was the top. He paused. She's not the top. Lena looked at the declassification document in her pocket. She thought about the collapsed beam in the flood basin, the man who had been trapped under his own roof, the 20 minutes that had mattered. She thought about the years between 2017 and now, and the specific shape of a life built to leave no federal footprint, and the question of whether that shape had been her own choice or a response to a pressure she'd never been able to locate clearly enough to push back against. She thought about the cylinder that had started all of this, a calibration tool in the bottom of a medical pack, forgotten, carried by habit, attached to a case number that someone had buried because they needed it buried, and to a name, her name, that someone had decided 8 years ago should stay invisible. Outside the terminal windows, the news vans were still there, and from somewhere behind her, from the direction of the employee corridor, came the sound of a door she was certain had been locked opening from the inside. Reeve moved first. He was already turning toward the corridor when the door finished opening, his hand going to his jacket in the reflexive way of someone whose training had compressed reaction time to something below conscious thought. Lena was half a step behind him, and what she saw when she looked past his shoulder stopped her for exactly 1 second, not from fear, but from the specific quality of recognition. The man in the corridor doorway was 60s, lean, in a gray suit that had been expensive 10 years ago and was now simply well-maintained. He had the kind of face that had once been unremarkable and had become, over time, distinguished. The architecture the same, but gravity and decision and the accumulated weight of years of specific choices having done something to the surface of it. He was carrying nothing. His hands were visible and open and at his sides. He had come through a locked door in the employee corridor of a regional airport, and he was standing in the entrance to that corridor with the posture of a man who had decided to stop running before he'd been caught. He looked at Lena, not at Reeve, not at the 2 Dryden Falls PD officers who were now turning from their positions near the checkpoint, at her. "Miss Voss," he said. Reeve said, "Don't move." The man didn't move. He kept his hands visible and his eyes on Lena and said, "My name is Warren Pell. In 2017, I was the intake director for the DV classification restricted channel. I read your report 17 hours after you submitted it." He paused. "I built the ghost account 4 days later. I am the person you are looking for." The terminal went the particular kind of quiet that happens when the ambient noise of a space doesn't change, but everyone in it stops generating their own. Reeve had his credentials out. The PD officers were moving toward the corridor entrance. Pell watched all of this without adjusting his posture or his expression, and that stillness, the voluntary, deliberate stillness of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it, was the thing that made Lena hold up one hand toward the officers. They stopped. Reeve looked at her. "Let him talk," she said. Pell sat at the checkpoint counter, not in the secondary screening room, not behind a closed door, but in the open concourse where Fetch and Greer and the remaining PD officers and a handful of travelers who hadn't been fully rerouted could hear every word. That was his choice. He'd asked for it specifically, which was the first thing he'd said after identifying himself. And Lena had agreed before Reeve could object because she understood what the choice meant. Not strategy, not negotiation, something older and simpler. He wanted witnesses. "I had a daughter," he said. "She was a contractor, defense procurement. She'd been trying to build a case against the same network you documented. The financial irregularities, the component diversion, the infrastructure access." He set both hands flat on the counter. "She brought it to me through the classified channel because she trusted that it would be protected. 6 weeks after I received her report, she died in a car accident that the investigation called unavoidable." The concourse was very quiet. "I buried your report because the people connected to that network were the same people I believed had killed my daughter, and I was afraid." He said the word without softening it. "Not of dying. I was afraid of what would happen if I made noise and the case got buried and they stayed in place and nothing changed. I had seen what they did when they felt exposed." He looked at his hands. "So I buried it instead. I built the cover. I kept it maintained. I told myself I was protecting the remaining witnesses. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment." He paused. "I was lying to myself. I was just afraid, and afraid people do things they can't take back. Lena sat 3 feet from him and felt the strange weight of this, the shape of 8 years condensed into a 60-second explanation. 8 years of her life, of the specific quiet she'd built, of the field work, and the regional airports, and the careful invisibility, and underneath all of it this, a grieving man who had made a wrong choice because he couldn't find a better one and had spent the years since carrying it. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Not this specific combination of things, understanding and anger, and something that was tired in a way that went past the 38 hours of no sleep and the day she'd just had into something older. "Why now?" she said. He looked at her. "Because this morning I watched you on the security footage. I had remote access to the system. I could see the checkpoint cameras. And I watched what Tanner did. And then I watched what you did after." He stopped. "The way you went onto the tarmac, the way you treated the patients, the way you handled Tanner and then Sable without flinching." He shook his head once. "You kept doing your job, through all of it, and I realized that I had been the thing in your way for 8 years, and that the weight of that was worse than whatever happened to me next." He reached into his jacket. Reeve tensed. Pell moved slowly and deliberately and produced a single USB drive, which he set on the counter and slid 3 inches toward Lena. "Everything," he said. "The ghost account construction records, the communication logs, the financial routing, 8 years of maintenance documentation for the cover I built and maintained." He looked at Reeve. "It includes material that goes above Sable. Names, dates, payment records. I kept records of everything because I was always planning to use them someday." He paused. "I just kept moving someday further away." Reeve picked up the drive, looked at it, then looked at Pell with the expression of a man recalibrating the scope of something he'd thought he understood. "You're going to need to come with me," Reeve said. "I know," Pell said. He stood, made no other movement. "I have one request." He looked at Lena. "I know I don't have the standing to ask it, but I'm asking." She waited. "Tell me that what she was trying to do, my daughter, that it mattered, that the original case is going to go forward." His voice stayed level, but there was something working underneath it that was visible if you were paying attention. "She believed it mattered. She died believing that. I want to know she wasn't wrong." Lena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant to submit a report into a channel you trusted and have it disappear. She thought about what it meant to carry work that nobody could see and keep doing it anyway. Not because you expected recognition, but because the alternative was not doing it, and not doing it was worse. She thought about her daughter, who had done exactly that and hadn't survived it. "It mattered," she said. "It mattered 8 years ago, and it matters today. The case is open. It's irrevocable. It's going forward." She held his gaze. "Her work is in that record whether her name is on it or not. That doesn't fix anything, but it's true." Pell nodded once. The motion was small and controlled, and whatever was underneath his voice stayed underneath it. And then Reeve put a hand on his arm and they walked toward the main entrance, and the Dryden Falls PD officers fell in around them, and the terminal concourse watched them go in the particular stunned quiet of people who have witnessed something they don't yet have language for. The next 2 hours were procedural in the way that Aftermath always was. Statements completed, evidence transferred, documentation processed, the legal machinery of consequence engaging with the slow grinding certainty of something very heavy starting to move. Hargrove drove back from the federal annex to oversee the evidence transfer from Pell's drive. The IG complaint package was updated to include Pell's materials, and when Hargrove's technical team ran the first pass on the documentation, what they found confirmed what Pell had said and then exceeded it. The network had 4 named participants above Sable's level. 2 of them were currently sitting on federal oversight committees. One held a position in a procurement agency that had awarded 3 contracts to the company whose credentials had been used in the cover. The financial routing in Pell's records showed 8 years of payments through accounts in 4 states. The documentation was detailed and sequential and had the slightly obsessive completeness of a man who had been maintaining a record he intended to use someday, and who had kept moving someday further away, and who had therefore had 8 years to make the record exhaustive. It would take federal investigators months to process it fully. Some of it would take longer. The people at the top of the chain had lawyers who were paid to make things take a long time. But the IG complaint was open. And open meant moving, and moving didn't stop. Tanner's statement, completed at 5:12 p.m., named 6 individuals within the airport's operational network and provided specific dates and transfer records that corroborated 3 separate incidents documented in Pell's files. He understood the arithmetic of his situation, how much cooperation was worth compared to silence, and he did the calculation in the direction that served him. That wasn't nobility. It was just how these things worked, and it worked in the same direction as everything else today, so Lena left it alone. Sable was formally arrested at 5:47 p.m. She was walked out through the main terminal entrance by 2 federal agents, not in handcuffs. The decision had been made to preserve the possibility of cooperation, and visible restraints complicated that, but with the unmistakable geometry of custody. Through the main doors, across the entrance plaza, past the reporters at the outer barriers who had cameras running and had been running them for hours. She kept her head level and her face composed and her eyes forward, and that composure, which had been professionally maintained all day, finally cost her something it hadn't before. You could see it in the slight tightness at the corners of her mouth, the way she didn't look at anyone. It was not a collapse in the cinematic sense. There was no dramatic moment where the mask came off. It was smaller than that, and in its own way more complete. A woman walking through a door she couldn't walk back through, with the cameras running and the story already written. 3 of the 5 news vans had her on live feed. Reeve found Lena at Gate 6 at 6:45. She was sitting with her pack on her knee and the declassification document in her hand, reading the second page for the 3rd time. Not because it was complicated, but because something about holding the physical paper helped her believe it was real. "Your flight," he said. He sat down 1 seat away, not beside her. The distance of a professional conversation. "Dryden Falls is resuming operations at 7:15. Your original booking has been reinstated and upgraded by airport management." He paused. "Their idea, not mine." She folded the document, put it in her pocket. "Fetch." "Probably fetch." She looked at the gate, at the window beyond it, which showed the tarmac coming back to life. Service vehicles moving, ground crew resuming positions, the ordinary machinery of air travel restarting with the pragmatic resilience of systems that couldn't afford to stop for long. "The IG process," she said. "I'll need to be available. Interviews, testimony, if it goes to prosecution. We'll work around your schedule." He paused. "Meridian Response has been notified that you were detained at a federal checkpoint and are cooperating with an active federal investigation. Their HR office said, and I'm quoting, 'Of course, she's exactly the kind of person we'd expect to be at the center of something like this,' which I think was a compliment." Lena made a sound that was almost a laugh. "There's one more thing," Reeve said. He produced a document from his jacket, thicker than the declassification notice, folded in thirds. "This came through the DV office while Hargrove was processing Pell's drive. It's been in the pipeline for a while, apparently. The IG complaint opening triggered its release." He held it out. "A formal commendation for the original field work in 2017. The report you submitted. It was written by your unit commander at the time of decommissioning and has been sitting in a sealed file because there was no clean way to deliver it." She took it, didn't open it. "He's been dead for 4 years, Reeve said. The commendation was written before that. He knew the report had been buried. He left instructions for it to be delivered when the case reopened." She held the folded document in both hands and looked at the window. There was a man who had believed her work mattered, who had written it down in a formal record before he died because he wanted her to know, someday, that someone had seen it and understood its value. He hadn't known when someday would come. He just made the record and trusted that it would reach her eventually. She understood, in a way she hadn't before today, that this was what work done in the dark looked like. Not the moment of recognition. Not the moment when the cameras were outside and the arrests were made and the story was on 5 news feeds simultaneously. Those things happened, or they didn't, and they mattered or they didn't in proportion to how much you'd let your sense of your own worth depend on them. What mattered was the work itself, done correctly, when no one was watching, in the knowledge that it was real, regardless of whether it was ever seen. She had submitted a report in 2017 because she had found something true and had believed that truth was worth recording. That had been her only authority for doing it. Not rank, not recognition, not the promise of outcome. Just the knowledge that it was real, and that ignoring real things was how you became a different and smaller version of yourself. Someone had buried it. Someone else had spent 8 years maintaining the burial, and the thing had survived anyway, the way true things sometimes do. Not because justice was inevitable, not because the world was tilted toward the right outcomes, but because a calibration tool she'd forgotten to take out of her pack had been recognized by the wrong person for the wrong reasons in a regional airport in Montana on a Tuesday in October, and the chain of that recognition had reached back 8 years to a report in an archive and pulled it into the light. That wasn't poetic. That was just how it happened. The truth didn't wait for a good moment. It waited for any moment. She opened the commendation. Her unit commander's name was at the top, and his signature at the bottom, and between them a paragraph written in the plain formal language of military documentation that nonetheless managed to say clearly, she found what no one wanted found, and she documented it anyway, and that was the job, and she did the job. She read it twice. Then she folded it back along its original creases and put it in her jacket pocket next to the declassification document and the drive and the suture kit. "Thank you," she said. Reeve nodded, stood. "Your gate board's at 7:05. He paused. "For whatever it's worth, what you did today was more than most people would have done with half the provocation and twice the resources." She looked up at him. "I treated some injured people and submitted a document. You kept your head when someone was trying to take everything you'd built. That's not small." He said it without performance, the way he said most things. "Take care of yourself, Voss." He walked back toward the checkpoint, toward the work that wasn't finished and wouldn't be for a long time, toward the machinery of consequence that she had set in motion today and that would run without her from here. She sat at gate 6 and watched the tarmac. At 7:05, when the gate agent called boarding, Lena stood and swung her pack onto her shoulder and joined the short line at the door. She was behind a family with 2 small children, one of whom was asleep against his father's shoulder, and ahead of an older man in a heavy jacket who smelled like the cold outside and had the tired, satisfied face of someone heading home after a long trip. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass, looked at the name, looked up at Lena. He was young, maybe 24, with the careful professional neutrality of airport staff who had been briefed that this particular passenger was someone the airport was treating with consideration tonight. "Ms. Voss," he said, "thank you for your patience today." She took her boarding pass back. "Just doing my job." She walked down the jet bridge. Behind her, through the terminal windows, the news vans were still running. The story was already out. The body camera footage, released by Reeves' office 30 minutes ago, had made it onto national feeds, and the footage was specific and undeniable and told the story of the morning in the clean, unedited way of things that don't need narration. People were watching it on their phones on the plane as they boarded. She could see them. She didn't watch it herself. She found her seat, stored her pack, sat down. The woman next to her, 60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, glanced at her once and then glanced again with the quality of recognition. Something from the news feeds, something from a phone screen in the last hour. "Excuse me," the woman said, not intrusively, tentatively. "Are you—" "Just a nurse," Lena said. The woman studied her for a moment, then smiled, small and genuine, and went back to her book. The plane pushed back from the gate. Lena looked out the window at the tarmac moving past, at the lights of Callaway International Airport, sliding backward as the aircraft taxied, at the dark Montana sky pressing down on the runway lights, and the flat terminal roof, and the parking structure, and the 5 news vans she could see from here lined up at the outer fence like a row of something that had decided this was worth their time. She thought about what came next, the IG process, the federal proceedings, the testimony. Her name in documents that couldn't be buried again because they were open records now, irrevocable, moving. The quiet life in Ridgecrest that was going to be something different starting tomorrow. She thought about the people who had decided she wasn't worth paying attention to, The ones who had moved her to the side of their calculations and made their plans around her absence. The ones who had looked at a tired nurse in faded scrubs and seen someone who could be handled. She had never been trying to prove them wrong. She hadn't come to Callaway International this morning to expose a network or resubmit a buried report or become the story that was running on 5 national feeds right now. She'd come to get through security and board a plane and drink something hot before a 2-hour flight home. The things she had learned, not today, not in a single morning, but over years of doing difficult work in places that didn't give you credit for it, was that the people who underestimated you were never really seeing you at all. They were seeing the surface of things and deciding that was enough. And when you kept your head down and did your work correctly and held your knowledge quietly and waited, you were not waiting for them to notice. You were just doing the work. The noticing was irrelevant. What was relevant was whether the work was real, whether you had done it honestly, whether, when it mattered, you had stayed in the room. She had stayed in the room. Every time, in every context, she had stayed in the room. Not because it was easy or because she was certain of the outcome, but because leaving the room was what you did when you had decided the truth was optional, and she had never been able to decide that. Some people spent their whole lives waiting to be seen before they do the thing that needs doing. She had never been one of them. The plane lifted off the Dryden Falls runway at 7:19, climbed through the gray October cloud layer, and broke through into the dark and the stars. Lena closed her eyes. She was asleep before they reached cruising altitude.